No one could save Billionaire's daughter until the maid everyone laughed brought a strange herb. The Whitmore estate stood like a monument to grief, its marble pillars gleaming cold under the morning sun. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the whispers of servants who moved through the corridors like ghosts themselves. At the heart of this magnificent prison lay a little girl who was slipping away from the world. Emma Whitmore, just 2 years old, had been the light of her father's life. Her laughter once echoed through these very halls, her tiny feet padding across imported Italian tiles as she chased butterflies in the garden. But that was before the illness, before the fever that wouldn't break, before the weakness that settled into her small body like winter frost. James Whitmore sat beside his daughter's bed, his tailored suit rumpled from 3 sleepless nights. At 32, he'd built an empire that spanned continents, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, but he was powerless here. His hand trembled as he touched Emma's pale cheek, her breathing shallow and labored. "Mr. Whitmore, the specialist from Switzerland has arrived," his butler announced from the doorway, his voice carefully modulated to convey urgency, without alarm. It was the 7th specialist in 2 weeks. James had flown in doctors from Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. Each had examined Emma with varying degrees of concern, ordered batteries of tests, prescribed treatments that showed no results. The diagnosis remained maddeningly elusive, some kind of neurological condition, they said, something rare, something they'd never quite seen before. The medications they tried seemed only to make her weaker. The Swiss doctor, a stern woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, spent an hour examining Emma. James watched her face for any flicker of hope, but found only professional concern deepening into troubled uncertainty. When she finally spoke, her accent was thick but her words were clear. "Mr. Whitmore, I must be honest with you. I've consulted with my colleagues across Europe. What your daughter has, it's beyond our current understanding. The seizures, the progressive weakness, the way her system rejects every treatment. I've documented everything, but I cannot give you the answer you need." She paused, and James saw something in her eyes he'd been dreading. Pity. "I'm sorry. Make her comfortable. That's all we can do now." The words hit him like physical blows. Make her comfortable. He knew what that meant. It meant they were giving up. It meant his little girl, his Emma, the only piece of his beloved wife Sarah he had left, was going to die. After the doctor left, James remained frozen in the chair beside Emma's bed. How could this be happening? Sarah had died bringing Emma into this world, bleeding out despite the best obstetric team money could buy. He'd promised his wife, in those final moments as she slipped away, that he would protect their daughter, give her everything, keep her safe. Now he was failing at the only thing that truly mattered. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes fluttered open, those same green eyes her mother had, now clouded with confusion and pain. "I'm here, sweetheart," James choked out, gathering her small hand in both of his. "Daddy's right here." "Hurts," she whimpered. James felt his heart shatter. He'd give anything, everything he owned, every dollar in his accounts, every property, every possession, if he could take her pain away. But money, for all its power, was worthless here. Through his grief, he was dimly aware of movement in the room. The household staff had been instructed to check on Emma every 15 minutes. He looked up to see one of the maids entering with fresh water. It was Maria Santos, the woman his head housekeeper had hired 3 months ago over his objections. Maria was different from the other staff. She was only 28, younger than he typically employed, and she hadn't come from one of the prestigious domestic service agencies. She'd shown up at the servants' entrance with a handwritten letter of recommendation from a priest in a poor neighborhood, asking for any work available. The housekeeper had taken pity on her and hired her for basic cleaning duties. The other staff had mocked Maria behind her back. She was too quiet, they said, too simple. She wore her dark hair in an unfashionable braid, her clothes were mended and remended, and she sent most of her wages back to family in the Philippines. She spoke softly in accented English and kept her eyes downcast. She wasn't sophisticated like them, they whispered. She didn't belong in a house like this. But Maria had always been kind to Emma. Before the illness, she would smile at the little girl when they passed in the hallways, would point out birds in the garden when she cleaned the windows. Emma had taken to her, would sometimes toddle over and grab Maria's hand, babbling happily. Now Maria set down the water pitcher with trembling hands, and James saw tears streaming down her face as she looked at Emma. Unlike the clinical sympathy of the doctors or the practiced concern of his regular staff, Maria's grief seemed raw and genuine. She looked at his dying daughter as if she were losing her own child. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," Maria whispered and fled from the room. James barely registered her departure. His world had narrowed to this bed, this moment, this unbearable reality. Outside, he could hear the whispers starting again, the household beginning to prepare for the inevitable. Someone had already contacted the funeral home, he knew. The efficient machinery of death was beginning to turn. He laid his head on Emma's bed and wept. Maria ran down the servants' staircase, her vision blurred with tears. She tried so hard to remain professional, to keep her distance as she'd been taught, but seeing that beautiful child suffering, watching her father's heartbreak in real time, it was too much. She found herself in the small room she shared with another maid on the third floor. It was sparse, just 2 narrow beds, a shared wardrobe, and a small window that overlooked the service courtyard. Her roommate was working in another part of the house, so Maria was alone with her grief. She sank onto her bed and pulled out the worn leather bag she kept hidden under it. Inside were her most precious possessions, a rosary her grandmother had given her, a photograph of her family back home, and a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The bundle contained dried herbs, plants her grandmother had taught her about in the mountains of Luzon. "These are old knowledge," her Lola had told her, pressing the herbs into her hands before Maria left for America. "The knowledge of our ancestors, before the hospitals, before the modern medicine. Don't forget our ways, Maria. Sometimes the old paths are the true paths." Maria had brought them to America as a connection to home, never thinking she'd need them. She'd learned to make tinctures and poultices at her grandmother's side, had seen the old woman cure fevers and infections and mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't explain. But that was in the mountains in a small village where such things were still respected. Here, in this gleaming mansion, with its army of specialists and modern medicine, what could her grandmother's herbs possibly do? And yet, the specialists had failed. All of them. Maria unwrapped the bundle with shaking hands. There, among the more common healing plants, was the one her grandmother had been most insistent about. It was called Damong Maria in their language, a rare fern that grew only in certain parts of the Philippine mountains, in the shadows of ancient trees. Her grandmother had used it only a handful of times for the most desperate cases. "This one," her Lola had said, holding up the dried fronds, "this one is for when the spirit is sick, not just the body. When the soul is forgetting how to live." Could that be what was wrong with little Emma? Maria had watched the child decline over the past weeks, had seen how the medicines seemed to make her worse, not better. What if it wasn't the kind of illness these Western doctors understood? What if it needed the old knowledge? But who would listen to her? She was just a maid, and a foreign one at that. She'd heard how the other servants laughed at her behind her back, how they mocked her accent and her simple ways. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, had told her more than once that she should be grateful Mr. Whitmore allowed her to work here at all. If she suggested treating Emma with herbs, they'd think she was crazy. They might fire her, send her back to the Philippines where her family depended on the money she sent home. They might even think she was trying to hurt the child with some kind of voodoo or witchcraft. But Emma was dying. Maria had seen enough death to recognize it. She'd watched it take her grandfather when she was young, had seen it circle her own mother before a healer in the mountains had driven it away with plants like these. She knew that look in Mr. Whitmore's eyes. It was the look of someone watching death steal someone they loved. She made a decision. She would prepare the treatment tonight, in secret. If Emma died anyway, no one would need to know. But if there was even a chance... Maria waited until midnight, when the house was finally quiet. The night nurse sat with Emma, but Maria knew she dozed in her chair during the early morning hours. She crept down to the kitchen, to the small preparation area where the staff made their own simple meals. Working by candlelight, her hands steady with purpose now, Maria began to prepare the damong Maria the way her grandmother had taught her. First, she had to rehydrate the dried fronds in pure water, not tap water, her Lola had insisted, but rainwater or spring water. Maria had saved some rainwater from last week's storm, kept it in a jar on the windowsill. As the herbs softened, she crushed them gently with a mortar and pestle, whispering the prayers her grandmother had taught her. They weren't Catholic prayers, though Maria said those too. These were older, prayers in a language even her grandmother couldn't fully translate, words passed down from healer to healer for generations. The resulting liquid was green and smelled of earth and growing things. Maria strained it carefully through clean cloth, collecting the precious drops in a small glass vial. It wasn't much, perhaps 2 tablespoons of liquid, but her grandmother had always said a little was enough, if the intent was pure. Now came the hard part. She had to somehow get this to Emma. She had to convince anyone to let her try. The next morning, Maria worked her usual duties with the vial hidden in her apron pocket. She cleaned the bathrooms, dusted the sitting rooms, changed the linens in the guest bedrooms. All the while, she listened to the whispers of the other staff. "The child won't last another day," Cook said to the butler, shaking her head sadly. "Mr. Whitmore hasn't left her room since yesterday," one of the footmen reported. "He's not eating, not sleeping. Mrs. Patterson is worried he'll collapse." "A tragedy," the butler intoned. "First the wife, now the daughter. That family is cursed." Maria's hand closed around the vial in her pocket. This was her chance. If Emma was truly that close to death, if Mr. Whitmore was that desperate, maybe, just maybe, he would listen to her. But doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if the herbs made Emma worse in her final hours? What if she caused that little girl more pain, instead of saving her? What if Mr. Whitmore's grief turned to rage, and he had her arrested, prosecuted, deported? She thought of her family back home. Her mother who needed surgery, her younger siblings who depended on her income for school. If she lost this job, they would suffer. But then she thought of Emma's tiny hand reaching for her just last week, before the child had become too weak to move. She thought of Emma's laugh, bright as bells, when Maria had shown her a butterfly in the garden. She thought of Mr. Whitmore's face, broken with grief, and she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try. That afternoon, Maria asked Mrs. Patterson for permission to speak with Mr. Whitmore. The head housekeeper looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Mr. Whitmore? Whatever for?" "The master is in no condition to deal with staff requests. If you need to speak with someone, you speak with me." "Please," Maria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's about Miss Emma. I might be able to help." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from irritation to anger. "Help? You? Don't be ridiculous, girl. Do you think you know better than all those fancy doctors? Than the specialists who've come from around the world? You should be ashamed of yourself, bothering the family at a time like this with your nonsense." James Whitmore hadn't slept in 48 hours. He sat in the chair beside Emma's bed, his body present, but his mind wandering through memories. Emma taking her first steps, reaching for him with chubby arms. Emma laughing as he pushed her on the swing in the garden. Emma asleep on his chest, her small body rising and falling with each precious breath. Now those breaths were becoming fewer and farther between. The nurse had adjusted the oxygen mask twice in the last hour. Emma's lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made James's stomach clench with fear. "Mr. Whitmore." Mrs. Patterson's voice came from the doorway, apologetic and hesitant. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, but there's a matter that requires your attention." James barely glanced up. What could possibly require his attention more than watching his daughter die? "Handle it yourself," he said, his voice raw. "Sir, it's about Maria. The maid. She's insisting she needs to speak with you about Miss Emma. She claims she can help." Something in the housekeeper's tone, a mixture of disdain and embarrassment, made James look up. "Maria? The one Emma liked." Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned. "Yes, sir. The Filipino girl. I've told her it's inappropriate, that she's being presumptuous, but she won't listen. I can dismiss her if you'd like, save you the trouble. Send her in, James said. Sir? Send her in. James's voice was flat. What did it matter? What could possibly make this worse? If one of his staff wanted to pay respects or offer condolences, he could endure 5 minutes of it. Mrs. Patterson disappeared, her disapproval evident in every line of her rigid posture. A few moments later, Maria entered the room, and James was struck by how frightened she looked. She was trembling, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes red from crying. Mr. Whitmore, she began, then seemed to lose her nerve. She stood there, struggling for words, looking between him and Emma with such genuine anguish that James felt a flicker of curiosity penetrate his grief. What is it, Maria? Sir, I know I have no right to speak. I know you've had the best doctors, the smartest people in the world trying to save Miss Emma. But they haven't helped, have they? The bluntness of it should have offended him, but James was too tired for pretense.
No.
They haven't. Maria took a shaky breath and reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small glass vial filled with green liquid. In my country, in the mountains where I'm from, we have old medicine. Medicine from our grandmothers and their grandmothers. This, she held up the vial. This is made from a special plant. It's for when modern medicine doesn't work. For when the sickness is different. James stared at the vial. Was this woman seriously suggesting he give his dying daughter some kind of folk remedy? Some third-world herbal concoction? His first instinct was anger. How dare she offer him false hope with her superstitious nonsense? But then he looked at Emma, at her pale face and labored breathing, and he realized, what did he have to lose? The specialists had given up. The medications had failed. His daughter was dying anyway. What's in it? He asked. Maria seemed surprised he was engaging at all. It's called Damong Maria in my language. A type of fern that grows in sacred places in the mountains. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me how to prepare it. I've seen it cure things that doctors couldn't explain. And you think it can help Emma? I don't know, sir, Maria said, and James appreciated her honesty. But I know the doctors have tried everything and nothing has worked. Sometimes Western medicine doesn't understand everything. Sometimes the old ways know things that have been forgotten. James looked at the vial again, then at Maria's face. She believed this. She genuinely believed she might be able to save his daughter. He could see it in her eyes, not the calculated optimism of the specialists trying to manage his expectations, but real, desperate hope. The doctors will say I'm crazy, he said slowly. Yes, sir. They'll say it's dangerous. That we don't know what's in it or what it might do to her. Yes, sir. I could lose her even faster. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She's dying now, Mr. Whitmore. I watched my grandfather die from something similar. The medicines the clinic gave him made him worse, just like Miss Emma. But my grandmother's herbs, they brought him back. Not quickly, but they brought him back. James stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah had loved sunsets. She'd made him stop and watch them with her, even when he was busy, even when he had calls to make and deals to close. The world is giving us a gift, she'd say. The least we can do is appreciate it. What would Sarah do in this situation? She'd always been the brave one, the one willing to take chances, to trust her instincts even when they defied logic. She'd married him against her family's wishes, had believed in his business ideas when everyone else thought he was crazy. She'd lived by her heart, not her fears. How much do you give her? James asked. Maria stepped forward, hope and terror warring on her face. Small amounts every few hours. We have to introduce it slowly to her system. And if it doesn't work, then at least we tried, sir. At least we tried everything. James made his decision. He turned to face Maria fully.
Do it.
But I'll be here, watching. If anything goes wrong, if she seems worse at all, we stop immediately. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Maria's hands shook as she approached Emma's bed. She measured out a tiny amount of the green liquid, barely a quarter teaspoon, and mixed it with water in a medicine dropper. The night nurse had left the room during their conversation, probably scandalized by what she was hearing. It was just the three of them now, James, Maria, and Emma. "Can you lift her head a little, sir?" Maria asked softly. James gently cradled his daughter's head, supporting her as Maria carefully placed a few drops of the mixture on Emma's lips. The child didn't swallow, didn't react. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emma's tongue moved slightly, and some of the liquid trickled into her mouth. James held his breath, waiting for he didn't know what. A reaction? A miracle? A disaster? Emma's eyes fluttered, but didn't open. Her breathing remained labored. Nothing changed. "We wait now," Maria said quietly. "In 4 hours, we give her more. Then 4 hours after that. The healing takes time." "Or it doesn't work at all," James said, but there was no accusation in his voice. Just exhaustion. "Or it doesn't work at all," Maria agreed. She set the vial on the bedside table. "I'll stay if you permit, sir, in case you need help with the next dose." James nodded. He settled back into his chair, and Maria took a seat in the corner of the room, keeping a respectful distance. The room fell silent except for the hiss of oxygen and Emma's labored breathing. 4 hours later, they administered the second dose. Then another 4 hours after that. Through the night, they maintained their vigil, the billionaire and the maid, united in their desperate hope, watching a little girl fight for her life. By morning, there was still no change. Emma remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin pale. James felt hope beginning to drain away. It had been foolish to believe, he told himself. Foolish to trust in folk medicine and grandmother's tales. But Maria kept her post in the corner of the room, her lips moving in silent prayer, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. And something about her faith, her absolute certainty, kept James from giving up entirely. "Tell me about your grandmother," James said as dawn light crept through the windows. He needed something to focus on besides his fear. "The one who taught you this." Maria looked surprised to be spoken to, but she answered softly. Her name was Remedios. She lived to be 93, and she was healing people until the day she died. People would come from other villages, walking for days, because they'd heard she could cure what others couldn't. Did she ever fail? Yes, Maria said honestly. She always said that some people, the universe calls them home, and no herb can change that. But she also said that sometimes people just need the right medicine. Not the expensive medicine or the modern medicine, but the right medicine. On the third day, something changed. James had dozed off in his chair despite himself, exhausted beyond endurance. He woke to Maria's urgent whisper. "Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, look." He jerked awake, his heart pounding with fear. But Maria wasn't pointing at something wrong. She was smiling, tears streaming down her face. Emma's eyes were open. Not just fluttering, but truly open, and they were focused. Looking around the room with recognition instead of that terrible blank stare she'd had for weeks. "Emma?" James breathed, afraid to believe it, afraid to hope. "Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but it was there. It was her voice. James grabbed her hand, feeling warmth in her fingers where there had been only cold for so long. "I'm here, baby. Daddy's here." Over the next hours, the change became undeniable. Emma's breathing grew stronger, easier. Color began returning to her cheeks. She was able to swallow some water, then some broth. By evening, she was sitting up slightly, asking for her stuffed rabbit. The transformation was so dramatic that the night nurse threatened to quit, insisting there was something supernatural and unholy at work. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with her understanding of the world. James called in the doctors, the ones who had given up, who had told him to make Emma comfortable in her final days. They examined her with growing confusion and disbelief. Her vitals were improving. The mysterious seizures had stopped. The weakness that had consumed her was receding. "I don't understand," the Swiss specialist said, reviewing the charts. "This shouldn't be possible. Not this quickly." "Mr. Whitmore," What changed? What did you do differently? James looked at Maria, who stood quietly in the corner, trying to be invisible. She shook her head slightly, a plea not to expose her, not to bring attention to what she'd done. She was afraid, James realized. Afraid of being mocked, or worse, accused of witchcraft or quackery. But his daughter was alive. His daughter was getting better. He owed Maria everything. Her, James said, pointing to Maria. She saved my daughter. Every eye in the room turned to the young maid, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from shock to horror. Sir, surely you don't mean? This is Maria. She's just a cleaning girl. She doesn't have any medical training. She gave Emma an herbal treatment, James said firmly. Traditional medicine from the Philippines. And it worked when nothing else did. The Swiss doctor's face darkened. An herbal treatment? Mr. Whitmore, do you realize how dangerous that could have been? Giving an unregulated substance to a critically ill child? You could have killed her. You could be prosecuted. And this woman, she turned to Maria with barely controlled fury. She should be arrested for practicing medicine without a license. She saved my daughter's life, James said, his voice hard. While you were giving up, while you were telling me to prepare for her death, this woman had the courage to try something different. Look at Emma. Look at her. She's alive. She's improving. That's all that matters. We need to know exactly what she gave the child, another doctor insisted. There could be drug interactions, side effects. It's called Damong Maria, Maria said quietly. All eyes turned to her again. She was terrified, James could see, but she stood a little straighter. It's a fern from the Philippine mountains. My grandmother used it to treat neurological conditions that Western medicine couldn't cure. I prepared it the way she taught me. That's completely unscientific, the Swiss doctor said. There's no research, no studies, no FDA approval. And yet my daughter is alive, James interrupted. You can run your tests, document what you want, but Maria isn't going to be arrested or punished. She's going to be rewarded. Over the next week, Emma continued to improve. The doctors ran every test they could think of, drew vials upon vials of blood, scanned and monitored and measured. They found traces of compounds they didn't recognize, unusual but not harmful activity in Emma's brain chemistry, signs of healing that defied their expectations. It's remarkable, one researcher from a pharmaceutical company said, having been called in to analyze the herbs. Some of these compounds have properties we've never documented. This could revolutionize treatment for certain neurological conditions. Mr. Whitmore, would you be willing to fund research into this plant? If we could isolate the active ingredients, synthesize them. But James was barely listening. He was too busy watching Emma play with her blocks, hearing her laugh again, seeing her run, though the doctors said she shouldn't run yet. She needed to take it easy, through the garden, chasing butterflies just like she used to. Maria had been moved to a guest room on the second floor. Mrs. Patterson had objected strenuously, saying it wasn't proper for a maid to stay in the family quarters, but James had overruled her. He'd also tripled Maria's salary and told her she was now Emma's personal caretaker, not a cleaning maid. The other servants didn't know what to make of it. Some were resentful, whispering that Maria had used witchcraft or trickery. Others were simply confused by this sudden elevation. But a few, particularly the older ones, looked at Maria with new respect. They'd seen what she'd done, seen the miracles she'd performed with nothing but her grandmother's herbs and her own courage. One afternoon, James found Maria in the garden with Emma. The little girl was showing Maria a caterpillar she'd found, her face bright with excitement. Maria was crouched down at Emma's level, listening with the same attention she might give to a queen. Maria, James said, approaching them. Could I speak with you for a moment? Maria stood quickly, smoothing her dress, though it was a proper dress now, not the maid's uniform she'd worn before. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Emma, sweetie, why don't you take that caterpillar to the terrace? We'll come look at it in a minute. Emma skipped off, carefully cradling the insect in her hands, and James turned to Maria. She looked nervous, he noticed. Even after everything, even with her new position and salary, she still seemed to expect to be dismissed, to be sent away. I owe you an apology, James said. Maria blinked in surprise. Sir, when Mrs. Patterson hired you, I thought she'd made a mistake. I thought you weren't sophisticated enough for this household. I barely noticed you. And then, when my daughter was dying, when I had given up hope, you had the courage to step forward and offer help, even knowing you might be ridiculed or punished for it. I just wanted to help Miss Emma, Maria said softly. She's such a sweet child. She reminds me of my little sister back home. You risked everything, your job, your income, your future, because you couldn't stand to watch her die. That's not just courage, Maria. That's heroism. Tears welled in Maria's eyes. I'm not a hero, sir. I'm just someone who remembered what my grandmother taught me. Your grandmother must have been an extraordinary woman.
She was.
She always said that the greatest gift we can give is to ease someone else's suffering, even if it costs us something. She said that's what makes us human. James felt something shift in his chest. When had he forgotten that? When had he become so focused on money and status and the trappings of success that he'd forgotten the simple humanity of caring for others? I want to do something for you, he said. Something more than just a raise. What can I do? What do you need? Maria hesitated, then said quietly, My mother needs surgery. Back in the Philippines. It's for her heart, but it's expensive, and we've been saving for years, but we don't have enough yet. Consider it done, James said immediately. The best cardiac surgeons, the best hospital, all expenses paid. And your family, are they struggling financially? My younger brother and sister are in school, but it's hard for them. The fees. I'll set up a fund for their education. Through university if they want it. And your mother won't have to work anymore. She'll have a pension. James saw Maria's face crumple with emotion and added gently, It's the least I can do, Maria. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back my life. Thank you, Maria whispered, covering her face with her hands. Thank you so much, sir. They stood in the garden, surrounded by roses and jasmine, while Emma sang to her caterpillar in the distance. James realized that a month ago, he wouldn't have noticed the flowers, wouldn't have heard his daughter's voice, wouldn't have seen the quiet dignity of the woman standing before him. Nearly losing Emma had broken something in him, but Maria had helped fix it. Not just his daughter, but him. As summer faded into autumn, the Whitmore mansion became a different place. The change was subtle at first, then increasingly profound. It started with James himself. He'd always been a distant employer, communicating with his staff only through Mrs. Patterson, treating them as functionaries rather than people. But after Emma's recovery, he began greeting them in the hallways, asking about their families, actually seeing them. He learned that the footman, Robert, was caring for a sick mother, that the cook, Mrs. Chun, had a grandson with learning disabilities who struggled in regular schools, that the gardener, Miguel, had a daughter who wanted to be a doctor but couldn't afford medical school. James couldn't solve every problem, but he could help. Mrs. Chen's grandson was enrolled in a specialized school. Miguel's daughter received a full scholarship. Robert's mother got the care she needed. Word spread among the staff, and the atmosphere shifted. People smiled more. They spoke to each other with kindness instead of petty rivalries. The mansion felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. At the center of this transformation was Maria. She'd become indispensable to the household, not just as Emma's caretaker, but as a bridge between James and the rest of the staff. She had a gift for seeing what people needed, not just medical care, but emotional support, a kind word, a moment of recognition. The other servants, who had mocked her before, now came to her for advice. The butler asked her opinion on household matters. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had fought so hard against her presence, began to thaw, acknowledging that perhaps she'd been too quick to judge. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Some of the older staff members resented the loss of hierarchy and formality. They grumbled that Mr. Whitmore was getting soft, that he was being taken advantage of by these people who should know their place. One particularly vocal critic was Gerald, the estate manager, who'd been with the family for 15 years. He took his concerns directly to James one October morning. Mr. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about the household expenditures, Gerald said, spreading papers across James's desk. The costs have increased significantly since the changes you've made. The scholarships and medical expenses, you mean? James said, not looking up from his own work. Yes, sir. And with all due respect, some of these seem excessive. The gardener's daughter, for instance, a full ride to medical school? That's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Miguel has worked for this family for 12 years. His daughter is brilliant. Why shouldn't I help her? Because it's not your responsibility, sir, Gerald said, his frustration evident. These people are employees. You pay them fair wages for their work. Anything beyond that is charity, and charity should be given thoughtfully, not impulsively. James finally looked up, studying his estate manager. Gerald was 55, efficient, practical. He'd helped manage the Whitmore fortune through investments and careful spending. He was good at his job. But he was also, James realized, fundamentally missing the point. Gerald, what would you say is the purpose of money? Sir?
Money. Wealth.
What's it for? Gerald looked confused by the question. To provide security. To build more wealth. To maintain your position and legacy. I used to think that too, James said. I used to think success was about accumulation. Making more, having more, being more. But then Emma got sick, and I realized that all my money couldn't save her. All my wealth and power and connections were useless. But you found the solution. Maria found the solution. A woman who makes a fraction of what you do, who is almost nothing by our standards, saved my daughter's life. She risked everything to help a child who wasn't even her own. That made me ask myself, what have I done with all my wealth? What have I actually done that matters? Gerald shifted uncomfortably. You've built a successful company, sir. You employ hundreds of people. And I can do better by them. I can see them as people, not just workers. I can help them the way Maria helped Emma. James leaned forward. Gerald, I'm not going to stop being successful. I'm not going to throw money away. But I am going to use what I have to make a real difference in people's lives. If that makes you uncomfortable, I understand, but I'm not changing course. Gerald left the meeting tight-lipped and unhappy, but James didn't care. He'd made his decision, and it felt right in a way that purely financial decisions never had. That evening, he found Maria reading to Emma in the nursery. It had become their routine, dinner at 6, bath at 7, then story time before bed. James often joined them, savoring these quiet moments with his daughter. Daddy, Emma called when she saw him. Maria's reading about the princess and the pea. I think the princess is silly. Just sleep on the floor. James laughed, settling into the chair beside them. Maybe the princess was just used to something different. Like you were, sir? Maria said softly, a gentle teasing in her voice. It had taken weeks, but Maria had finally become comfortable enough to occasionally joke with him. James appreciated it. Everyone else in his life treated him with such deference that real conversation was rare. Exactly like me, he admitted. I was used to one way of living, one way of seeing the world. And then you showed me something different. After Emma fell asleep, James walked Maria back toward her room. They'd fallen into this habit too, these quiet conversations in the evening, discussing Emma's progress, household matters, or sometimes just talking about life. I had an interesting conversation with Gerald today, James said. He thinks I'm being too generous with the staff. Maria's expression became carefully neutral. It's not my place to comment on such things, sir. Maria, please. You've saved my daughter's life and fundamentally changed my perspective on everything. I think we're past such formality. I want to know what you think. She considered this, then said carefully, in my country, there's a concept called bayanihan. It means community unity, helping each other. When someone builds a house, the whole village comes to help move it. When there's a celebration, everyone contributes food. We take care of each other because we're all in this life together. And you think I should apply that here? With people who work for me? I think. Maria paused, choosing her words. I think money is like rain, sir. It falls from the sky as a gift. Some places get more rain than others, but that doesn't mean they earned it or deserve it more. It's just how it fell. And when you have abundant rain, isn't it right to share it with the dry places? Not out of obligation, but out of recognition that we're all part of the same ecosystem. James had never thought of wealth that way. He'd always believed he'd earned every penny through hard work and smart decisions. But Maria was right. He'd also been born into opportunities that others never had. He'd had education, connections, seed money from his parents. Yes, he'd worked hard, but so had Miguel and Maria and countless others who would never have what he had. "You're wise beyond your years," he said quietly. Maria smiled. "My grandmother's wisdom, not mine. She always said the measure of a person isn't what they accumulate, but what they give away." Over the following months, James put this philosophy into practice. He established a foundation to research traditional medicines from around the world, particularly those from indigenous cultures. He endowed a scholarship program for the children of service workers. He met with his company's HR department and implemented new policies: better healthcare, paid family leave, education assistance. Not everyone understood or appreciated the changes. Some shareholders grumbled that he was wasting profits on social programs. Business publications ran articles questioning whether James Whitmore had lost his edge after his daughter's illness. But James didn't care. For the first time in his adult life, he was sleeping well at night. He looked forward to coming home. He engaged with Emma in ways he never had before, not as a father checking a box on his to-do list, but as a parent who genuinely delighted in his child's presence. And increasingly, he found himself seeking out Maria's company, not just as Emma's caretaker, but as a friend. They would talk for hours about philosophy and culture, about her life in the Philippines and his childhood in New England, about dreams and fears, and what it meant to live a good life. He began to notice things about her he'd missed before. The grace in her movements, the gentleness in her voice, the way her whole face lit up when she smiled. The profound kindness that radiated from her, not as a performance, but as a fundamental part of who she was. One evening in December, as they sat in the library watching Emma play with her blocks, James said, "You know, you never have to go back to the Philippines if you don't want to. I mean, to visit, of course, whenever you want. But this could be your home. Permanently." Maria looked at him, surprised. That's very generous, sir, but my family could visit here. Or you could bring them here. Your mother, your siblings. There's certainly enough room." James gestured around the enormous mansion. "You would do that? Maria, your family now. You saved Emma. You've saved me too, in a way. I don't want you to feel like you're just an employee. You're part of our lives." Maria's eyes shimmered with tears. "Thank you, James." It was the first time she'd used his first name, and hearing it in her soft voice made something warm bloom in his chest. Something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. Something he'd thought he'd never feel again. He pushed the feeling away, not ready to examine it too closely. It was too soon, too complicated. Maria was younger than him, had been his employee. The power dynamics were all wrong. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. Spring came to the Whitmore estate, bringing with it cherry blossoms and warm breezes and a sense of renewal. Emma, now 3 years old and healthy as any child could be, ran through the gardens with boundless energy, no trace remaining of her illness. Maria's family had come to visit. Her mother, recovered from her successful heart surgery, her 2 younger siblings wide-eyed at the mansion's grandeur. James had arranged for them to stay in the guest house, and watching Maria with them, seeing her joy at having her loved ones close, made his heart ache with a longing he couldn't name. One afternoon, James found Maria's mother, Elena, tending to the herb garden Maria had planted behind the greenhouse. She was a small woman, weathered by hard work but with the same gentle strength her daughter possessed. "Mrs. Santos," James greeted her. "The garden is looking beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Maria tells me you gave her permission to plant these herbs." "It's very kind." After what her herbs did for Emma, it seemed the least I could do. James hesitated, then asked, "May I ask you something? About Maria?" Elena looked up, her dark eyes knowing. "You want to know if my daughter's heart is free?" James felt heat rise to his face. Was he that transparent? I don't know if that's appropriate. "Mr. Whitmore," Elena said gently, setting down her trowel and facing him fully. I am a mother. I see how you look at my daughter. I see how she looks at you when she thinks no one is watching. I would be blind not to notice. I would never want to take advantage of her position or make her uncomfortable. Do you love her? The question was so direct, so simple, that James found himself answering before he could think. Yes. God help me. Yes, I do. Elena smiled. Then the question is not whether it's appropriate. The question is whether you will honor that love, whether you will see her as your equal, not as someone you rescued or someone beneath you. She saved my daughter's life. She taught me how to be human again. How could I see her as anything but extraordinary? Then you should tell her, Elena said. Life is short, Mr. Whitmore. My daughter knows this better than most. Don't waste time worrying about what others will think. But James did worry. He worried about the age difference, the power imbalance, what society would say about a billionaire falling in love with a woman who'd been his maid. He worried about putting Maria in an uncomfortable position, about people assuming she'd seduced him for his money. He said nothing, and the days passed. Maria's family's visit came to an end. At the airport, saying goodbye, Elena pulled James aside one last time. My daughter is too kind to tell you this herself, she said, but she loves you too. She has for months. And she's terrified that you see her only as Emma's caretaker, as someone useful, but not someone you could truly care for. That's not true. Then tell her. Before fear and propriety steal the happiness you both deserve. The flight left, and James drove back to the mansion in turmoil. That evening, he couldn't find Maria anywhere. Finally, one of the staff mentioned seeing her in the garden. He found her sitting on a bench near the rose bushes, crying quietly. She looked up as he approached, quickly wiping her tears, trying to compose herself. Maria, what's wrong? James sat beside her, resisting the urge to pull her into his arms. It's nothing. I'm just being silly. I miss my family already, that's all. That's not all, James said gently.
Please, talk to me.
Maria was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, Your mother spoke with me before she left. Your former mother-in-law, I mean. Sarah's mother. James felt his stomach drop. Margaret Hensworth had come by that afternoon, ostensibly to check on Emma. He'd thought the visit went well enough. What did she say? She was very polite.
Very kind even.
She said she appreciated how well I care for Emma, that Sarah would have been grateful. Maria's voice trembled. And then she said that she hoped I understood my place in this household. That she hoped I wouldn't get any inappropriate ideas about me, James finished, anger rising in his chest. She warned you away from me. She said people were starting to talk. That I was seen too often in your company, that it wasn't proper. She said that for Emma's sake, for the family's reputation, I should maintain professional boundaries. And what did you say? I said she was right. Maria looked at him, her eyes full of pain. Because she isn't she? I was your maid. You're a widower, a billionaire from a prominent family. I'm just Maria from the mountains. People will say I'm taking advantage. They'll say I seduced you, or that you're having a midlife crisis, or... I don't care what people say, James interrupted. He took her hands in his heart pounding. Maria, I've spent my whole life caring what people think, doing what's expected, following the rules. And it made me successful, but it didn't make me happy. The only time I felt truly alive in the past 2 years was when I've been with you and Emma. James. I love you, he said, the words tumbling out. I've been falling in love with you for months, and I've been too afraid to say it. Afraid of what people would think, afraid it was too soon after Sarah, afraid I'd put you in an impossible position. But your mother told me something today. She said life is too short to waste on fear. And she's right. Maria stared at him, tears streaming down her face. You love me? How could I not? You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. You're brave and kind and wise. You saved my daughter.
You saved me.
You made me remember what it means to really live, not just exist. I love you too, Maria whispered. I've tried not to. I've told myself it was impossible, that I should be grateful for what I have and not wish for more. But I can't help it. I love you. James kissed her then, there in the garden among the roses, and it felt like coming home. Like the final piece of healing clicking into place. They didn't rush into anything. They dated properly, going to restaurants and museums, getting to know each other outside the context of Emma's care. James was patient, wanting Maria to be certain, wanting to give her space to decide if this was truly what she wanted. But with each passing week, his love only grew stronger.
And hers did too.
6 months later, James proposed. Not with a grand gesture or public declaration, but privately, in the garden where Maria had first saved Emma's life. He'd worked with a jeweler to create a ring incorporating a small pressed fern frond, Damong Maria, preserved under crystal. "This plant saved my daughter," he said, kneeling before her. "It brought my family back to life. And you brought me back to life. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Maria said, laughing and crying at once. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The wedding, when it came, was beautiful but simple. They invited family and close friends, including all the household staff who'd become like family. James's business associates muttered about the unconventional match, but James didn't care. Margaret Hensworth was notably absent, still disapproving, but even that couldn't dampen the joy of the day. Emma, nearly 4 now, was the flower girl, scattering rose petals with gleeful abandon. During the ceremony, she interrupted the vows to announce loudly, "I love Maria. She makes the best pancakes." The guests laughed, and James saw Maria's eyes shine with tears of happiness. This was his family now. This was what mattered. In the years that followed, the Whitmore household continued to transform. Maria and James had 2 more children, a son they named after Maria's grandfather, and a daughter they named Remedios, after Maria's grandmother. Emma grew up healthy and strong, with no lasting effects from her childhood illness. The foundation James had established to research traditional medicines made breakthrough discoveries, identifying compounds in Damong Maria that eventually led to new treatments for neurological disorders. Maria worked closely with the foundation, ensuring that the communities who'd preserved this knowledge for generations were respected and compensated. The mansion, once cold and silent, rang with laughter. Maria's extended family visited often, and the gardens bloomed with both decorative flowers and medicinal herbs. The staff were treated as valued members of the household, and many stayed for decades, raising their own children in an environment of respect and opportunity. Sometimes, in quiet moments, James would think back to that desperate night when he'd been ready to give up. When all the money and power in the world hadn't been enough to save his daughter. When a young maid had stepped forward with nothing but courage and her grandmother's wisdom. She'd saved Emma, yes. But she'd saved him too. Saved him from a life of empty success, from the isolation of privilege, from the belief that wealth was what mattered most. "What are you thinking about?" Maria asked one evening, finding him on the terrace, watching the sunset. "Thinking about how one person can change everything," James said, pulling her close. "How the most important things can't be bought. How sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places." "Your wife is getting very philosophical in her old age," Maria teased. She was 35 now, with silver beginning to thread through her dark hair, more beautiful than ever. "Your husband is just grateful," James said. "Grateful that you were brave enough to offer that herb. Grateful that you stayed. Grateful for every day with you." Emma appeared in the doorway, 9 years old now, and tall for her age. "Mom, Dad, Grandma Elena is on video call from Manila. She wants to show us the new community garden." They went inside together. This family built not on blood alone, but on love and courage, and the willingness to see beyond the surface of things. In the background, the sun set over the garden where Damong Maria grew, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in laboratories or hospitals, but in the wisdom of those who remember the old ways. And sometimes the greatest healing is of the heart.